Hi, and welcome to Academics of PA. I'm here with my co-host, Josie Schafer, and I suppose I should say my name. I'm Bruce McDonald, so welcome to today's episode.
Hi, Bruce.
How's it going in Nebraska?
Oh, well, it's actually pretty rainy today. It's not great, but it's better than Colorado. I hear they have a lot of snow.
I'm not even going to ask why there's snow in Colorado in May.
Almost June.
So who do we have for our episode today?
We are so excited to have Hal Rainey on the episode. Hi, Hal. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I don't know that you need an introduction to our audience, but why don't you introduce yourself just in case?
I'm Hal Rainey. I'm a professor of public administration at the University of Georgia in the School of Public and International Affairs, Department of Public Administration and Policy, although actually I've been formally retired for about a year, and I'm emeritus professor now, but I still have my office and I still teach courses, and they can't get rid of me around here. I'm still working with doctoral students and colleagues because I like it here and I like this field very much, and I want to stay as active as I can.
Well, I think that was one of our first questions for you. How do you stay so engaged? You should be retired, but you're still with Georgia doing all the good work that you've done for many years. What keeps you so engaged?
Well, it's very kind of you to say nice things about my work. One way I have motivated myself and driven myself over the years is to always be not dissatisfied with what I've done, but very conscious of what I haven't done. And there's still an awful lot to do. But more positively as well, I have really valued being a part of this department and a part of the field of public administration and public policy studies, and I really have enjoyed my career very much. There are plenty of frustrations and challenges, but I feel very glad that I chose this as a career, and so I want to keep at it. You face some existential questions when you retire about what are you going to do with yourself, and there are not many things I'd rather do than be here with my colleagues and be trying to make a contribution.
No, I think that's a really good answer there's so much that's kind of going on that needs to be addressed and needs work and focus to be done around that situation, that just because you're retired doesn't mean you still don't have the capacity to help solve the problems that we're being faced with.
Well, I hope I can make a contribution.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into the field of public administration and maybe some of the substantive questions that you work on, the type of contribution you're trying to make?
Well, I got into public administration almost by happenstance. The background includes my growing up in Atlanta, Georgia. My father was a professor at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and my mother was a teacher, and they were very enthusiastic about their work and their careers, and I always thought it was a worthy and rewarding way to spend your career if you spend it in education. And they were also, back in the 1940s and 50s, I'm that old, involved in what would now be called community activism. Those terms weren't coined back then. They and their friends and colleagues were opposed to racial segregation of public facilities, and they worked in various ways to oppose racial segregation and to support racial integration of public facilities, including the universities and the schools and other facilities. And this made them very interested in politics and government programs and policies, and that was a part of our interest around my house when I was growing up. And I went on to undergraduate school with those interests. I became an English and psychology major, but also was always interested in political science and involved in some political campaigns and in history. And then when I graduated from undergraduate school, while I was an undergraduate, I was a VISTA volunteer on a Job Corps center, which was part of the so-called War on Poverty. The Job Corps still exists as a federal program to provide employability skills to young people who need help with or need support in trying to find employment. And doing that, it was supposed to be advanced training for the Peace Corps, and I was supposed to go in the Peace Corps, but I became still further interested in large-scale government programs aimed at social benefits and how they're managed or mismanaged, and organizational and leadership issues. And then it turned out when I graduated from undergraduate school, it was the Vietnam era, and they canceled all draft deferments, and I was drafted. And it's a long story, but I ended up as a naval officer for 4 years, and I never was assigned to go to Vietnam. But as a naval officer, I became still further interested in large-scale organizational activities in the public service and leadership and managerial issues. Then I applied sight unseen to doctoral programs in psychology in the United States and got into an excellent program in experimental social psychology at Ohio State University. And it was a really excellent program, and a lot of the people who were my fellow students went on to do very well. But I was not interested at that point in small group experimentation, and I ended up transferring in good relationships with my psychology professors to a fairly newly established program in public administration at Ohio State and got my PhD there. When I say this happened by happenstance, I happened to run into Brent Millward, who's now a well-established, well-known professional in public administration, a well-known scholar in the area of networks that you're probably familiar with. And Brent and I started talking, and he was telling me what he was doing, and that sounded like something I thought was very interesting. So I looked into it, and that's how I ended up getting into public administration. But it actually was an implementation of my interest in the topics I've already mentioned.
That's an amazing history.
Well,
yeah, completely blown away.
Well, you're kind to say so. None of it was very glamorous, but I was always interested in it. But then that's how I became a college professor, and that's how I became very interested in public administration, public policy, governmental programs. And I've concentrated on issues in organization theory and management and leadership and related topics. I got interested in those.
Can you talk a little bit about how those early interests and experiences in the military or around social justice how you started translating that into your research, that early research, or if it did?
Well, I did some research on affirmative action when I was in graduate school, and I've done some related research on diversity over the years. A lot of my research was not directly aimed at social justice, but more aimed at issues in how one understands government organizations and large-scale public service activities, and issues in the design, structure, effectiveness, strategy, etc., which was part of what organization theory was all about. Where I was at Ohio State, at first the public administration program was housed in the same college as the business school. And so I had a lot of business school professors, and I found out there was this large topic of organizational analysis that was about organizations and the people in them. And that was very relevant to my interest in how organizations in public service and in producing social benefits work or don't work, and the people in them. And so I found that a very exciting field and topic. And there was a wonderful smorgasbord of courses to take from excellent professors in business administration and public administration. And my advisor, Bob Backoff, and I, and his friend, Charlie Levine from Syracuse University, got interested in the differences between what we were interested in, management and organizations in government, and what the business school people were concentrating on, and that was mainly business firms. But there was this underlying, or this foundation topic of the nature of organizations and management and people involved in those activities that spanned both fields. And Charlie and Bob and I got involved in producing an article on the differences between public and private organizations. And we were able to get it published in Public Administration Review, and it became one of the most frequently cited contributions I've been a part of. So all of that was very exciting. But the theme of why there are public organizations and what's distinctive about them, if anything, was related to the whole challenge of providing effective public service. And I guess that's the link back to, how do you make the Job Corps work? How do you make the military work? How do you make social programs work? And how do you understand them? So I guess that's the linkage.
We think it's a pretty timely topic, the difference between public and private organizations. And so at the time that you were originally conceiving of this work, what did you see as the differences, and how do you think does it translate today? Are there differences? Why are we so ineffective at telling people there are differences? It's still really relevant work.
Well, I'm glad you think so. I'm trying to decide how I can answer your question without talking too much. My wife and I recently celebrated our 50th anniversary, and she knows me pretty well. And she told me on the way in to my office, when I was telling her I'm going to do this interview, she said, "Be sure not to talk too much," because she knows me pretty well. But
no, this is about you. You can talk too much. Go ahead.
One of the issues that I was debating with my business school professors, and I talk about in a book I've done on this topic, is that there is some people who study organizations take what many of us call a generic view, and that is that there really isn't a strong distinction between government and business when it comes down to basically dealing with the challenges that we face in management and organizations. A lot of the challenges are the same. And I accept that proposition in many ways. And in a sense, the business school professors would flatter the public sector people like me by saying, a lot of these stereotypes about government bureaucracy being bureaucratic and ineffective are just stereotypes. We have the same problems in business. But it was what we knew also was there's a sharp disagreement with those business school professors by people in economics and political science who always regarded government administrative agencies, which years ago they used to always call bureaucracies, that are not exposed to economic markets for their outputs and products, but rather are subject to political oversight. They're established through political oversight by political authorities. They're authorized and, in a sense, managed or overseen by political authorities. And a lot of us in public administration feel that makes a lot of difference. And while there are a lot of similarities, we think we can actually prove these days that there are important differences. Let me leave it at that when you mentioned trying to convince people that there are differences, part of the reason is that there are differences, and as I've mentioned, in ways they're not differences, that business firms have the same kinds of challenges that government organizations have, and that we all face.
I really think about when you said the stereotype, right? There's just a perception that it doesn't work more than...
You mean the government doesn't work?
Yeah.
When you say, why can't we get people to, I thought you were asking, why can't we get people to accept the point that there are differences in distinctive characteristics of public organizations? Sometimes the opposite is the problem. You can read almost weekly some statement in the newspaper where someone denounces government and denounces government bureaucracy as distinctively ineffective. And one of the things I've worked on some with my colleague Brent Millward and with other people is the defense of government administration, of public administration, against those kinds of stereotypes, because I'm always sermonizing to my classes and trying to show them examples of how many really effective programs and activities and examples of success there are in government and the nonprofit sector. And it is hard to get a lot of people in the United States to accept that, because there are so many problems and they get so much publicity. But if you really watch, there are just as many problems in business firms, if not many more. And if you really look at the public confidence surveys, they're just as skeptical of business firms as they are of government agencies when they are skeptical.
I think that's a good point. We always talk about that we should do things like a business because business is successful and governments fail, but the likelihood of a business failing is actually quite high.
Yeah, there are a lot of bankruptcies, and one of the ways Brent Millward and I co-authored an article years ago called "Don't Blame the Bureaucracy," and it's in the same genre of Charles Goodsell's great books on the case for bureaucracy. We were attacking some of these stereotypes, and when we talked about the run government like a business admonition, and we said, like which business? Like Enron? We could get, I think Madoff has some times on his hands. We could come out and have him run some of the government programs and improve. But there are all kinds of failures in the business system. That's where the generic perspective comes back in. A lot of those people are very well-meaning, and they say we've got these common challenges of how you structure and design an organization, how you make it effective, how you make decisions, how you motivate people, how you develop good leadership. And those are common challenges, and we all share them. And I agree with that, but I do think they're very distinctive challenges and characteristics of management and organization in the public sector.
So how do you bring your knowledge about what a good public, or what can be a good public sector organization and who are good public sector managers, to the classroom? What are those things that you try to teach and that you look for as being sort of distinctive of young public sector leaders?
Well, I have some ideas about that, but one of the reasons they can't get rid of me around here is, believe it or not, I teach a course in leadership in our program, and I'm not exactly joking. I'm half joking when I say I go into the class and tell the students that I don't know what leadership is really, and they have to help me understand it. And it's a very student-centered course, and we talk about all kinds of generic leadership challenges, like how you run a good meeting and how you deal with difficult people and how you respond to frustrations, but also about theories of leadership that concern when you are a more directive leader or when you are a more participative leader. And I argue to them that better knowledge, better grasp on their part of these leadership responsibilities and these perspectives on understanding leadership will make them better leaders. And talking to the people in our program and to other younger people and other people coming along, I always emphasize to them how much we need each one of them and how much we need them to develop their own leadership commitments and skills. Because every single person, every decent person who's willing and capable of making a contribution is vital to us, because we lose casualties along the way. People become ill and accidents happen, and we need everybody. And there are plenty of people in the world who are not the sort of people we'd like to have in the world, and that's why we need each of them. And they do a wonderful job of taking a lot of responsibility in the class and reporting on material and engaging in group discussions. And I guess I kind of joke that they like the class because I keep my mouth shut for a change and let them do a lot of the talking. I think that's one of their main attractions.
I like that approach. I don't know anything about this. Why don't you tell me?
Well, actually, I'm a little less modest than that. I do think I know some stuff, but I do emphasize to them, one of the constraints we face is the study of human behavior and human aggregates always has an element of inconclusiveness about it. We don't have a conclusive leadership theory. We don't have a conclusive motivation theory, but we can cover the theories and cover the topics I mentioned in ways that can help them absorb and implement these ideas in ways that are suitable to them that will make them better leaders.
Out of curiosity, how much do you think your experience in the Navy has influenced how you approach that class? The reason I ask is we have a number of people from the Army who take our MPA program, and whenever they get in our leadership class, they absolutely love it because it starts everything that they do and everything they know from their military background starts to make sense to them.
Well, one of the things I've had to learn to do in this class in relation to my military experience is to not have my feelings hurt when all the students start rolling their eyes because I'm talking about my military experience again. I'm kind of joking, but I refer to examples from my experiences as a military officer about issues in leadership, issues in when you delegate responsibility or empower people, as opposed to when you have to provide more guidance and so on. We have military officers in our class too. We had a naval officer in my last class who was an ensign. She was female, and there weren't any female ensigns when I was in the Navy, and we had a great time talking about her experiences. But the not just the military people. When I taught this class with more experienced people in our off-campus master's program, which is identical to our on-campus program, I found that the more experienced the person in the class, the more they were up in middle management, if they were a military officer and so on, the more they really took to the format of the course, because a lot of what it asks them to do is to take the material we're covering and apply it to thinking about their own experiences and vice versa. How do their experiences inform the topics we're talking about? And I was very, very happy the first few times I ever taught the course with more experienced military officers and others, how much they really value the chance to reflect on how their experiences related to the topics we were covering in the course and vice versa. So, one of the reasons to make the course more student-centered, and I don't want to overemphasize that, I try to make a very strong contribution to the course, but I let them make a lot of choices and carry a lot of the activities. But one of the reasons to make it student-centered is a lot of the people in the course, including the people right out of undergraduate school, have so much to contribute that I feel it's important to let them do that and to bring their own experiences and their own capabilities to bear on the material in the course. And they certainly seem to enjoy it and value the process.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. And I think that we've talked a lot about on this podcast about how much students benefit from having instructors with that kind of experience and that ability to reflect on that experience and bring that to the classroom, particularly. I mean, I think for both in-service and out-of-service students.
Sure.
So we talked sort of how you got into public administration. Can you tell us a little bit about your early career in public administration and, picking up on some of that public-private sector distinctions, but what else you were working on and who you were working on? And yeah.
I got my first job out of graduate school at Florida State University, went there as a regular faculty member, and we had responsibilities for, as usual, for teaching, university and departmental service, research, and to some degree to public service. And I just continued my research interest there, trying to publish and do more work on the comparisons of public and private organizations and some other topics. And one thing I think helped me was I tried to stick to branching out from my core interests in the nature of public organizations into topics that fit or that grew out of that interest. And I started to develop an interest in large-scale organizational change, which, according to some people, is harder and more complicated in the public sector, and other types of topics like that. But I was basically just really having great experience teaching MPA students in MPA courses. We had a lot of people who are active in state and local government in Tallahassee, Florida, and there were a lot of experienced mid-level managers as well as people just out of undergraduate school, and the sort of people, Bruce, that you might have in your class, military officers, police officers. In our program, we have some great people from the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta and others who are experienced. And so I was just working pretty hard teaching and trying to do a good job at that and trying to continue my research. But we also, there was an interest in outreach and public service, and we would work on various kinds of executive training activities. And I wasn't as involved in that as some other people. But one of the things besides being a military officer, one of the things that I can talk to my students about are other involvements that I've had in applied research and teaching, consulting kinds of activities with a variety of different federal agencies and state agencies and local government activities. For example, one of the research projects I was involved in down there was with the Florida League of Cities, doing research to help urban officials and the people in the Florida League of Cities understand why the people of Florida wanted a draconian tax rollback, which was going to come up as a referendum, why they didn't understand how much public services cost and how much this tax rollback was going to create difficulties. And it was kind of interesting and ironic. We would hear from, we were dealing with all sorts of really very fiscally conservative and otherwise conservative government officials who were saying that they'd been trying to hold taxes down for years, and now the public wanted taxes to go down even further. And we need, our infrastructure was challenged and so on. And it was, but we did some very valuable research for them in which we produced evidence about how the public, members of the public felt about their city and urban services and taxes. And so I did some of those kinds of things. But in doing that, part of what I've really liked about public administration is in some of the research projects and some of the professional activities, you get drawn into working with people, as we call them, practitioners. And you get those kinds of experiences. And when I come back into class and start talking about those kinds of experiences, I seem to gain a little bit of credibility with the students. In other words, that this is just not some sort of campus-bound person, but I've learned some things besides my military experience. Among other examples, in my interest in organizational change, I published an article on that with my former doctoral student and colleague, Sergio Fernandex, who's now at the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana. And I've been invited to go to such places as the National Institutes of Health and to work with some groups in Army contracting units on the issue of managing large-scale organizational change. And I find it very interesting because they're interested in my general knowledge about management of organizational change, even though I don't know an awful lot about what they're doing. But it's very similar to my courses. We come together on their efforts to listen to me talk about what the nature of large-scale organizational change and what research and inquiry tell us about successful organizational change and large-scale change, and apply it to their own needs. Because so many places, it's sort of a fundamental issue in organizations is how do we make things better? And then, of course, in all sectors, but especially the public sector, they're sort of constant ongoing themes of the need for reform and the need for improvement. And so there's a general interest in that. So I think the public administration field offers a lot of opportunities to be involved, whether or not you're a full-blown practitioner, to be involved in the world of practice in ways that can help inform you in the classroom. And you can hope to make a contribution to the people out there trying to solve real-world problems.
So that's a topic that I'm particularly interested in. And so can you talk a little bit about how practitioners know to come to you and how you have, what kind of service and help you've offered back to practitioners, and how has that looked, and a little bit more about those experiences?
In regard to organizational change, one of the ways people apparently ended up inviting me to come and talk with them in NIH and other places is they read the article Sergio and I published in Public Administration Review or heard about it. And of course, the first thing I told them was you ought to call Sergio, because he did the lion's share of work on that article. And, I found out years ago, one way to prosper in academics is to get great students like Sergio and take advantage of their ideas and take credit for their work. That's a joke, actually. But one thing we did in the article we published was to say we have reviewed a lot of research on organizational change, and here are 8 conditions that about which there's a consensus in the literature on the nature of successful large-scale organizational change. And maybe sometimes these conditions aren't present, but this is what, for the most part, a lot of different observers have said needs to happen. And they're very general, and in a way they're not tight guidelines, but such things as making sure you have leadership for the change. That may sound simple, but often you find large-scale change programs going on without effective leadership and without clear-cut leadership, and making sure you have a widespread support for the change. Now, that doesn't always have to happen, but we've had people respond to the article by saying, we just did a large-scale change effort, a large-scale reform, and we didn't do about 4 or 5 of these things. And so one of what they want to hear and seem to value is just the discussion of here's what the literature that we reviewed and covered and our own experience tell us are the characteristics and conditions of successful large-scale change for the most part. And they sit there and, again, they digest this and say they may have contradictory examples and want to debate and argue about things. But for the most part, they say, basically, this is a pretty good checklist. So a lot of the times I'm not very good at playing the guru and going in and telling everybody what to do. What I like to do is go in and share ideas with people who are facing a change or who want to know more about it. In our we have an entity here called the Institute of Government, the Carl Vinson Institute, and they run executive education kinds of programs. And I, for some years, went and talked with that group of about 100 people every year about large-scale organizational change. And a lot of what I enjoyed about it was these were pretty experienced people in state, local, and federal government in the area, in Georgia and in Atlanta, and they just really enjoyed and valued talking about their own experiences and how they fit with the guidelines or set of conditions that Sergio and I identified, how they might not fit, and that sort of thing. So the interchange and the digestion of our suggestions has been very valuable for them and for me. And I would come back to the classroom and talk about what they had said and what examples they had given, and it helped to make me better able to contribute in class.
Oh, I think that's amazing.
So one of the things that came up on Twitter when I think everybody kind of realized you were getting ready to retire was the book that you wrote a few years ago that you've had, the multiple editions, Understanding and Managing Public Organizations. It's kind of become this hallmark that a lot of people use in their classroom. And when it became known that you were retiring, there was this fear of, well, what happens if the book doesn't get updated? Is somebody going to take over it? If neither of those happen, what's everybody going to do in terms of having a good resource for the classroom? I guess kind of what I'm a little bit curious about is, you've had this body of literature and you've had this book that's been going on for several decades now through the multiple editions. Have you kind of thought about what comes next for it, or?
Well, I've thought about that a lot, and actually I'm thinking about it now and very recently. I think my colleague Andy Whitford, I don't do Twitter.
Oh, so he's always on there.
Yeah, well, I have a fine student named Ki Wan Jin, who's a Chinese student, and he calls himself Roger. And Roger is a whiz at all the IT stuff and information communication technology. And he put me on Twitter, and I removed myself from Twitter about 2 weeks later. I'm just not a Twitter kind of person. But as I understood it, I mentioned to Andy that I was thinking that I probably wouldn't do another edition of the book because I was retiring. And I think Andy started some of that. That's just my impression, and started some of that discussion. But the considerations for the book are that it's a lot of work. I've been through 5 editions on it now, and I always try to review a lot of research in the book because basically there are some coverages of public and nonprofit organizations that talk a little bit about their distinctive nature and then go on to discuss some of the main topics in organization theory and organizational behavior, like motivation and leadership and organizational design and structure and organizational change. But I wanted my coverage of that to be as grounded in actual research as possible because of what we talked about earlier. There are a lot of stereotypes and assertions, but what do we really know? Well, a lot of the use of the book is in MPA courses, and some of the MPA students are not all that interested in all that literature review. A lot of PhD students seem to really appreciate the book, and it gets cited a lot by researchers. But one issue is, one of the positive issues is there's so much research going on now and developing so rapidly that it's very hard to cover it all. And so just the work of covering all the recent research, look at a topic like public service motivation, where there are hundreds of studies now, trying to summarize all that and assess it is quite a challenge. And it's just a matter of, is there that much demand for the book? Did people want it to continue? And am I able to keep that up in retirement because I don't have the same resources and the same. I'm in discussions with some people about whether they might come in as a co-author and we can continue the book, and whether we might try to change the character of the book a little bit to relax my aspirations to have it being a scholarly research-based book and make it a little more of a textbook. So there's still considerations of that. And One, I've always kind of goaded myself, as I said, about what I haven't accomplished, and I'm pretty well aware of shortcomings of that book. And I sometimes feel pretty modest about the book, and don't feel that anybody's going to exactly be devastated if I don't do another version. There's some other good books out there, but since there's a possibility there might be some interest in continuing interest in my book, I'm not going to help advertise anyone else's book right now.
Well, I'll tell you the story just so you know how passionate people feel about that book. Last week, I had a student in my office and I said that you were going to be on the podcast, and she jumped out of the seat and like gasped, and she was like, "Oh, I love that book." I was like, "You love it?" I love that book. So people love that book.
Well, thank you very much. I have had, you'll never get rich doing a book like this. The royalties aren't bad, but they're not very generous royalties compared to an awful lot of other academic books, and especially compared to more popular books. But I did it partly as I hoped, a service to the field, because I thought we needed a book that talked about the application of organization theory, management, organization behaviors topics to the distinctive context of public service and the public sector. And so I have had some nice compliments on the book over the years, and that's my real reward. And I really appreciate your saying that. But I'm pretty modest about the indispensability of the book. But I am working. I hate to give up the contribution that the book makes, assuming that it is making a contribution. But I have had some very gratifying expressions of appreciation of the book, and I appreciate your passing that along, and makes me think about that when I'm trying to decide what I can do about it now.
When we first started talking, you talked about that one of the reasons you're still engaged in research is that there's lots of questions that are still out there that you want to answer. You've certainly had a fairly prolific career over time. How do you choose what topics you focus on at any given point? So if you have 5 paper ideas in your head, how do you decide the priority for them?
Well, the way I got into the topic of public versus private organizations, or the distinctive nature of public sector organization theory and analysis and management, was simply by way of opportunity, and relates to one of the questions you tentatively mentioned, or you might come up, was what might you have done differently, or what lessons have you learned, kind of thing. One thing you do is you seize opportunities and you take reasonable risks. And one way I've tried to identify opportunities is what I call staying power. And I talk to my doctoral students about this when we're trying to help them decide on topics they'll pursue. Is the topic important enough to maintain continuing importance to a lot of people, or can it grow and expand in that way? And in other words, does it have substantive staying power for the field? Is it a sufficiently important topic for us to have people in the field like me and others investing resources in it? And can it make a contribution in that sense? And then there's a personal dimension to staying power. Is this something you can remain fascinated with and remain committed to, and have the resilience to suffer the frustrations you're going to suffer in pursuit of any topic? Do you have the staying power? And when Bob Backoff and Charlie Levine and I started working on the topic of what's the difference between public and private organizations years ago, I just thought it was a really fascinating question. We had these people in the business school saying there really isn't any difference, and then we had literature and economics and political science saying, yes, there is. And this is a very fundamentally important topic. We have public administration. Well, what's public about it? What does public mean? And we have, if you look at the work of some of the great political scientists like Robert Dahl and Charles Lindblom, have a fundamental issue in all different nations about what should government do and what should non-governmental activities do, and why, and what's the difference. So it was a fundamentally important issue and absolutely fascinating because there was this controversy, but it's also extremely difficult and complex to deal with. But I felt like it was something I could really invest in. And actually, one important aspect of it was my interest began with, in a sense, with a failure because we were putting together the literature on the topic. They were the professors, Charlie and Bob, and I was a graduate student, and I was doing a lot of the compiling and note taking and summarizing of literature as we worked on the topic. And we were doing it for an NSF grant on whether there are differences in innovation processes in the public and the private sector. And turned out the grant was denied. We didn't get funded. And of course, we were not exactly thrilled about that. But Charlie Levine, as my friend and colleague Bob put it, hit the ground running. And he said, well, look, we've done all this work. It's important. Let's do a PAR article. Let's do an article and submit it to public administration review. So we turned this literature review and this thinking we'd been doing into a public administration review article and got it published there. So in a sense, it started out as a kind of flop, but then worked out okay. But I just felt it was a very fundamentally important topic. We could do something valuable and useful, and I had to take that opportunity. And Bob and Charlie will always be important to me because they could have taken a lot of the credit for the work that we did, but they let me have a great deal of credit because I worked hard. And that's always influenced the way I deal with my doctoral students, in spite of what I was joking about earlier. I feel like they did it for me, now I owe it to my doctoral students. But then later, topics came up like organizational change. I could work on that growing out of the literature on public versus private organizations because it covers that topic. Another topic has to do with organizational goals that some of us have been working on recently, in the nature of organizational goals. Well, one of the most frequent observations about the distinctive character of government and the nonprofit sector is that we don't have a bottom line. We don't have profit indicators and sales indicators as incentives and sources of information. And so our goals are much more difficult to define precisely and to assess precisely. And so that an interest in that topic grows out of the interest in public versus private organizations and management processes. So one thing I've tried to do is to find fascinating and important questions, but that are closely enough related to what I've always been doing so that I'm not drifting off onto something for which I have insufficient preparation. That's just my way of doing things. I just spent some time with Bert Rockman, who's a wonderful scholar. He came through and visited, and one thing that's intimidating for me about Bert is he's done wonderful work on all kinds of different topics, and some people can do that, but I couldn't. And so I've tried to branch out from what I thought I could do well to other things that seemed sufficiently important to have staying power, and I had sufficient interest in them to maintain my own staying power with the topic.
I think you just created a great checklist for researchers to start to think about how and what to work on and how to judge if that's appropriate or good or how that's going to work for them. So yeah. I think our scholars will really appreciate that advice.
Well, I hope so. They may want to consult my doctoral students first because they'll probably say, we get so tired of hearing that from him that we don't want to hear it anymore. So, but I hope it is a helpful thought for people thinking about how to develop a dissertation and so on.
Well, we're coming up on time, so we want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and sharing your wisdom and experience. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and to think about these things, and I do hope it might be useful. Well, since I'm not on Twitter, this makes me more motivated because I won't have to listen to myself. But the I guess one thing, it's kind of corny, but if people coming along in the field, one thing I say to my students, and I've said to some of the student groups I've been asked to talk with, was just to emphasize how much we need each one of you and how important each of your contributions is, and how much we need every decent person who wants to make a contribution. And I didn't always think that way when I was a graduate student. I thought I was kind of inconsequential, but I've always wanted my students and others to realize just how important each one of them is.
I think that's a great way to end. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's nice talking with you.